Flowers are some of the most beautiful living things on the planet. They're also incredibly important. Flowers are responsible for the development of fruits, nuts, and seeds that feed billions of people. Bees and other animals depend on flowers to provide nectar for food. We, in turn, eat a product produced by bees, honey. In some cases, we eat flowers themselves, such as broccoli and cauliflower. And flowers enable over 300,000 species of angiosperm plants to reproduce. They're the fundamental reproductive structures of flowering plants. During the next few minutes, we're going to investigate the fascinating ways flowering plants and other types of plants, such as mosses, seedless vascular plants, and gymnosperms, reproduce. If you've ever eaten strawberries or raspberries, you've eaten fruits from plants capable of reproducing asexually. The term asexual means without sex. In other words, asexual reproduction does not involve the process of fertilization. The offspring produced are genetically identical to the parents and to each other. Most plants, such as these aspen trees, have the ability to reproduce sexually and asexually. Being able to reproduce both sexually and asexually has some distinct advantages. For example, in a stable environment with abundant resources, asexual reproduction is faster than sexual reproduction and tends to produce well-adapted offspring. Because asexual reproduction is quicker, it often enables plants to outcompete other plants for resources. Asexual plant reproduction that occurs naturally is called vegetative reproduction or vegetative propagation. This sort of reproduction can occur in several ways. You observe. Describe the structure to which this strawberry is attached. It's a thin vine-like structure that grows along the ground, and it's called a stolon or runner. Stolons grow along the ground and produce buds capable of growing into new plants. Some plants, such as bamboo and ferns, carry out asexual reproduction via specialized underground horizontal stems called rhizomes. Rhizomes produce roots below the surface and send out shoots to create new plants. White potatoes can reproduce asexually via different structures called tubers, which are the enlarged part of the underground stem and the part we call the potato. Potatoes are often cut up into pieces and planted, enabling each portion of a tuber to flourish into a new plant. Bulbs and corms are other examples of modified underground stems that give rise to new plants. As these plants grow, small bulbs or corms sprout from original ones. Crocuses, gladioli, and daffodils reproduce from corms. Tulips, lilies, and onions reproduce asexually from bulbs. While most plants reproduce asexually, almost every plant has a phase in its life that involves sexual reproduction. The two major processes involved in sexual reproduction in plants are meiosis and fertilization. Meiosis is a type of cellular division in which the number of chromosomes changes. In this process, gametes are produced. Fertilization, another key process, involves the fusion of male and female gametes to form a zygote. Plants differ in when, where, and how in their life cycle these processes occur. In some ways, the process of sexual reproduction is more complex than in animals. One such complexity relates to plant life cycles. Plants possess two distinct stages, referred to as alternation of generations. For plants, alternation of generations involves two phases, the Gametophyte phase and the Sporophyte phase. Each phase has a different outward form and has distinct cellular characteristics. In the Gametophyte phase, gametes are produced. Gamete cells are haploid, meaning they have only one complete set of chromosomes from each pair of homologous chromosomes. The spore-producing plant, called the sporophyte, is the diploid phase of a plant life cycle. The cells of the sporophyte have the complete complement of chromosomes. During the growth of the sporophyte, some of the cells undergo meiosis to form haploid spores. When the spores are released, they develop into haploid multicellular gametophytes, or, depending on the plant, they develop gamete-producing structures. In most plants, one phase is more obvious than the other and is referred to as the dominant generation. The dominant generation in all plants except mosses is the diploid sporophyte phase. These low-lying green plants, clinging to rocks, are mosses, examples of bryophytes. There are over 25,000 species of bryophytes in three major phyla: liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. These simple non-vascular plants can reproduce asexually or sexually. In most bryophytes, the haploid gametophyte phase is dominant. It's what we commonly recognize. Bryophytes tend to produce separate male and female gametophytes. Sperm are produced in the male gametophyte in a reproductive organ called the antheridium. Mature sperm swim to the female reproductive structure called the archegonium, where the female egg is fertilized. You decide. Why do bryophytes tend to live in moist environments? Because sperm must swim through water to fertilize eggs, bryophytes tend to live where water is abundant. As a result of fertilization, a diploid zygote forms that eventually grows into a diploid sporophyte. The sporophyte consists of a simple leafless stalk that lives on the gametophyte. At the tip of the stalk is a capsule. Within the capsule, haploid spores are produced. When mature, the spores are released and they germinate. They form new haploid gametophytes, completing the reproductive cycle. These ferns are examples of seedless vascular plants. Seedless vascular plants, such as ferns, horsetails, whisk ferns, and club mosses, possess specialized conducting tissue called vascular tissue that's responsible for moving materials throughout the plant. These plants do not reproduce via seeds. Let's take a look at the life cycle of a fern. It's a relatively common seedless vascular plant. You've probably seen ferns in their leafy diploid sporophyte stage. Fern sporophytes form spores via the process of meiosis. Some ferns form clusters of spores called sori on the underside of fronds. When a mature spore is released and lands in a suitable location, it develops into a tiny heart-shaped haploid gametophyte form called a prothallus. The prothallus has both a male antheridium that produces sperm and a female archegonium that produces an egg. Sperm from the antheridium can fertilize an egg on the same plant, or they can swim to an adjacent gametophyte to fertilize an egg there. Over time, the fertilized zygote grows into a sporophyte, completing the life cycle. These amazing redwood trees, growing on the California coast, are among the largest living things on the planet. A group of seed plants called Gymnosperms includes several major phyla, including the Gametophytes, cycads, ginkgo, and the most abundant Gymnosperms, conifers. The dominant phase in Gymnosperms is the diploid sporophyte stage. Gymnosperms do not form flowers, but they do form seeds. Let's look at the life cycle of a conifer called a pine. The mature sporophyte pine produces two types of cones, separate male and female cones. Both often appear on the same tree. The male cone, called the pollen cone, has sporangia on the underside of each scale. In each sporangium, many haploid spores are formed that make up male gametophytes, called pollen grains. In the larger female cone, called the seed cone, two sporangia are located on the upper surface of each scale. The sporangia produce haploid female gametophytes. Each gametophyte forms 2 or 3 archegonia. Within each archegonium is an egg cell. In the process of pollination, pollen is transferred via the wind or by other means from the male pollen cone to the female seed cone. Of the millions of pollen grains released from sporangia, some land on the scales of female cones near an opening called the micropyle. As the pollen grain matures, its tube cell grows through the micropyle and into the female ovule, forming a pollen tube. 2 male sperm enter the ovule, where one fuses with the egg and fertilizes it. Over time, the resulting zygote develops into a seed that consists of a complete plant embryo. Eventually, the mature seed is released from the cone. Under favorable conditions, the seed germinates and grows into a new sporophyte. Flowering plants, the Angiosperms, are by far the most successful, diverse, and abundant plants on Earth. Much of their success is due to their reproductive strategies. Like Gymnosperms, the sporophyte generation is dominant, and water is not needed for fertilization. But Angiosperms are different from all other plants in that their reproductive structures are contained in flowers. Gametophytes are quite small in Angiosperms and develop in the flower of the sporophyte plant. Female eggs form in ovules inside the ovary of the flower. The female gametophyte consists of a haploid egg and a large cell with 2 nuclei, referred to as polar nuclei. In the male reproductive part of the flower, haploid spores called microspores are produced in a structure called the anther. The microspores consist of 2-celled male gametophytes that together make up a pollen grain. Once the pollen grains are mature, the anther breaks open, exposing pollen to the air. In the next step, called pollination, pollen is transferred from the male anther to the female part of the flower, called the stigma. Pollen can be transported by the wind or by pollinators, such as insects and birds or other animals. When a pollen grain lands on the sticky stigma, it forms a pollen tube through the thin style to the ovary. Once in the ovary, the pollen tube enters the ovule. 2 haploid sperm nuclei then enter the embryo sac. Fertilization occurs when one of the sperm cells fuses with an egg in the ovules, resulting in a diploid zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo, but soon stops developing and enters a stage of dormancy. A process unique to angiosperms, called double fertilization, occurs when the second sperm cell fuses with the two polar nuclei in the ovule. This results in a triploid cell with 3 sets of chromosomes. It develops special triploid tissue called endosperm. Endosperm tissue nourishes the seed embryo when it sprouts. Both the dormant seed embryo and endosperm become surrounded by a tough seed coat, forming what we call the seed. In many plants, the surrounding ovary develops into fleshy fruit that can serve as an important source of food for humans and other animals. When conditions are favorable, seeds sprout and over time grow into a new sporophyte plant. During the past few minutes, we've explored some of the amazing aspects of plant reproduction. We began by discussing some of the different ways plants reproduce asexually, via stolons, rhizomes, tubers, corms, and bulbs. Sexual plant reproduction was also described, highlighting meiosis and fertilization. Various aspects of alternation of generations were described, and more specifically, the life cycles of mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms were explained, all in our brief overview of the fascinating features of plant reproduction. Fill in the correct word to complete the sentence. Number 1. Plant reproduction that does not involve fertilization is called reproduction. Number 2. Potatoes can reproduce asexually via an enlarged part of underground stems called Number 3. Haploid gametes are produced in a type of cellular reproduction called Number 4. Plants possess 2 distinct stages, referred to as of generations. Number 5. The spore-producing plant generation is called the Number 6. Must be present for fertilization to occur in bryophytes. Number 7. In ferns, the tiny heart-shaped prothallus is and produces gametes. Number 8. In gymnosperms, gametes are produced in structures called Number 9. The male anther produces male gametes contained in grains. And number 10. Unique to angiosperms, a process called Fertilization occurs when two sperm fuse with different structures in the ovule.